Welcome, one and all, as we continue our study of the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. I'm Edwin Weber, one of the pastors at St. Mark's, and I'm happy you are joining me on this journey through the Bible. Last time, we ended things with the defeat of Saul at the hand of the Philistines. Saul and his sons die in battle, and when David hears of Saul and Jonathan's death, he tears his clothes and weeps aloud. He says, "O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in crimson and luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lays slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women." Now, the depth of David's love both for Saul and Jonathan is so powerful. It's quite touching. David has been so magnanimous with Saul all through these times when Saul was tormented by this spirit, and even as Saul tried to kill David. Why would David be any different in his disposition towards Saul and his death? And then, for Jonathan, to place this affection, this friendship, on par with or even above his relationship with women, it really speaks to the intimacy of the friendship, as well as the depth of David's sorrow here. He is a deep feeler. At least that's the impression that we get from these passages. Now, David becomes the first king of Judah at the death of Saul. And there's a little bit of drama with this fellow named Abner. Abner was the commander of Saul's armies. But eventually Abner is on David's side too. And at this point, David becomes king of all of Israel. Quite a big deal. And it's at this point that David finally sets his eyes on the city of Jerusalem. And this is the passage here from 1 Chronicles. David and all of Israel marched to Jerusalem, that is Jebus, where the Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land. The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, "You will not come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, now the city of David. David had said, "Whoever attacks the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander." And Joab, son of Zeruiah, went up first. So he became chief. David resided in the stronghold. Therefore it was called the city of David. He built the city all around, from the Millo in complete circuit. And Joab repaired the rest of the city. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. And now with the conquest of Jerusalem behind him, we can now say that we finally have a united kingdom of Israel. And we can actually look here on the map. This is going to split apart into Israel and into Judah. But, during the time of David, this kingdom was united. Pretty big deal. It was also united under Solomon, so it's going to break up after Solomon's death. And that's the thing, is that the United Kingdom would not last very long in the grand scheme of things. But at least we finally get here. If you think about Joshua and Judges, both of those books emphasize that the conquest was never completed in those days. But in many ways, it was completed in David's day. Um, David makes Jerusalem the capital of the kingdom. And up to that point, David had actually reigned in Hebron. And it's actually interesting because when you think about Judah, and even when you just think about the Jewish faith in general, you always really think about Jerusalem being the center point. But until this point, Jerusalem was a city of Gentile foreigners. Now, David goes on to fortify the city. He builds a palace on this there in the city of David. On the mountain right next to the city, he brings the Ark of the Covenant, which had been in other places. It had been in Nob at one point. It had been in Shiloh in another. And this was really big to do, to bring the Ark to Jerusalem. Lots of singing, lots of dancing. And of course, if you've ever heard the story about David dancing naked before the ark, this is actually where the story is from. It's when the ark of the Lord was brought to Jerusalem. But David actually didn't dance naked. What he does do is he sets aside his kingly garb and he dons a simple white linen ephod. Now, Michal, you may remember her. She is Saul's daughter, and she's David's first wife. She actually sees David dancing in front of the ark, out of his kingly robes, and she scoffs at him, saying that it's not dignified for a king to do such thing. But David doesn't much care. He simply takes delight in praising God. Now, the ark would remain right there next to the city of David on Mount Moriah. I'll bring up that image of Jerusalem in David's day. And you'll see here, there is Mount Moriah. That's where the temple would be built. The rock, that literally is the rock of the dome of the rock. This is where the temple ruins are today. In David's day, you can see that the city of David was just aside from that, and that's Jerusalem in his day. But it was there on the threshing floor, which is where David brought the Ark of God. And it's where it would remain throughout his life. There's actually a reason. David requested, David even asked God, that he wanted to build a temple, a house for the Lord. But David did not end up building the temple because God asked him not to. And instead, God states that it will be David's son who will build the temple. And of course, next time we will talk more about Solomon and him building the temple. God does make a covenant with him. It says that his descendants would sit on the throne forever. And of course, though we know that that's not the case. In fact, so did the authors who wrote this down in Chronicles and in Samuel. They knew that the exile would see the end of the Davidic line. This is all, because, the person who wrote Samuel, they wrote the end of Kings. The person who wrote First Chronicles wrote Second Chronicles. And they know the exile is the end of this story. And it will be the end of the Davidic line of kings. Now, by the way, this is all being conveyed to David, this whole part about, you won't build the temple, your son will. It's all being conveyed by the prophet Nathan, who now is sort of our new prophet. Nathan is Samuel's successor. And, just as he's going to have a similar relationship. He's going to have a similar relationship with David that Samuel did with Saul. Now, at this point of time, David continues his conquest. He brings in more and more surrounding kingdoms, or surrounding territories, I should say, into the kingdom. This really is the high point of his reign. And if you know anything about human nature, you know that those that fly highest have the farthest to fall. And David's fall from grace would be a pretty spectacular one. Now, really, up to this point, there's been no fault that can be found with David. He has been a warrior, yes, but a good and just one. He had lived among some Gentiles for some time, but that was only while he was on run from Saul. And, they're really small, insignificant blemishes on an otherwise spotless record as God's anointed. And then Bathsheba and Uriah. So the story that is told in Samuel is that one day Samuel was on the roof and he looked out and he saw a woman bathing. She was participating in the ritual washing of the whole body that was prescribed under the law of Moses. And this was because she had just finished menstruating. So she actually was engaged in an act of worship when David spied on her, sort of a peeping Tom, and desired her, coveted her. David learned that she was Bathsheba, this wife of Uriah the Hittite. Uriah is one of David's fighting men, and who, as it turns out, is actually off fighting David's battles for him right then. Now, even though she was married, David sent men who took her to the palace, and David had sex with her. Now, nothing is mentioned about Bathsheba's consent in this Bible story. And I mention this because sometimes Bathsheba is viewed as this temptress who seduces David. But really, nothing couldn't be further from the truth. Because if you read the story carefully, it is actually David's actions that are emphasized. It is David's actions and his actions alone that has the say in this story. Bathsheba, it just seems very passive. And I mean, it's understandable. How could you possibly deny your king? Well, despite the improbability of becoming pregnant so soon after menstruation, Bathsheba conceives, and so she sends word to David. But David comes up with a plan. He's going to pass off his child as Uriah's. And he's going to do this by inviting Uriah from the battlefield to the palace under the ruse that David wants a report of what's going on. And he hopes that while Uriah is visiting Jerusalem, he will sleep with Bathsheba. Now, as it turns out, the first night that Uriah is there, he ends up sleeping on David's doorstep and even refuses to go home, saying that how could he possibly have the comfort of being with his wife when his men on the battlefield are deprived of the comfort of their wives? So the second night, David actually tries again. This time he gets Uriah drunk, but his fraternal loyalty wins out, and he actually ends up just crashing on David's couch. So the next day, David sends Uriah back to the battle lines, and he gives him a letter for Joab, the commander of David's armies. In the letter itself was a death sentence for Uriah, and it was delivered by his own hand. In the letter, David instructed Joab to place Uriah in a precarious position in battle, and then to withdraw the army from him so that he would be surrounded and exposed. And Uriah fell in battle. When Bathsheba's mourning period was over, David brought her to the palace, and she became his wife. she gave birth to a son. But in all of this, I ask you now, how do you think God will react? So I wanted to read this passage directly from 2 Samuel 12 because it's just a perfect parable here. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and he said, there were two men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up and grew it up with him and was with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man. He was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who would come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who came to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Now, Nathan goes on to say that as a result of all of this, a disaster would be visited on David's house. And specifically, what Nathan says is that David's wives were going to be given over to his neighbors for sexual relations. This is something that actually never happens, but it would be exactly what David did to Uriah in this story. Instead, the little child that was born of Bathsheba and David falls sick and dies. Which is really just sort of tragic. It's so sad. While the child was ill, David prays and fasts before God, before the ark. He hopes that the child would recover. He holds out hope, but it doesn't happen. And in the end, this little innocent life ends up suffering for the sins of his father. I really struggle with that. It's not fair or just. And, certainly in our discussion on Thursday evening, we could talk about it more together. From here on, David's reign has challenges, shall we say. He's over the zenith. He's now on the tail end. There's this sort of slow decline here. Most notably, not once, not twice, but 3 times. 3 separate occasions, David has to deal with rebellions during his reign. And 2 of which were actually his own sons. Now, most famously, Absalom attempts to usurp the throne. Now, this is in part because of some family drama that's going on, but really what happens here is that Absalom desires to be in a place of authority that he has not been given that authority. Early in this story about Absalom sort of stands by the city gate and he waits for people to come in who are looking for an audience with the king to resolve disputes and questions. He sits by the gate and he does this. Instead, he is the person who is dispensing judgment, supplanting his father's rightful role as a king. In the end, it results in an armed conflict. During a battle, Absalom's hair gets tangled up in a tree, and His steed walks on and leaves him hanging by his hair in a tree. And he's vulnerable in this way, and so he is struck down. David mourns the death of Absalom when he hears of his death, and even to the detriment of his own reign. Because the people who were with him, he was mourning in public, the people who were with him, they questioned, why would he mourn for somebody who wished him dead? And once again, David shows himself to be a deeply empathetic person, mourning over the death of Absalom. Now, years later, there was another revolt by this person, somebody named Sheba. It was put down, not a big deal, but revolt number 2 in David's reign. But one last one was when David was on his deathbed. There was a succession struggle between Adonijah and Solomon. Or really, it was between Adonijah and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. She is the one in this story who ends up securing Solomon's reign. And she does this by directly appealing to David on his deathbed. She comes to him with the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan. And David ends up giving his blessing, and Solomon is anointed king. Now, Adonijah is convinced that David is going to die any moment, so he's already gathered his supporters together for a feast. Kind of a bit of impropriety, already celebrating your reign when your father isn't even dead yet. When the people that are gathered together, when they hear the crowds acclaiming Solomon as king, the party and Adonijah's support for a kingship immediately evaporates, just completely disappears. And in the end, he ends up throwing himself on his brother's mercy. Now, in the end, David died while a struggle over who his successor would be was still being decided. That's a really challenging end for someone who burned so brightly in his youth. So much of our faith is shaped by the story of David, from his fight with Goliath in his youth to his composition of songs of praise to our God. He is a deeply faithful person, a deep feeler whose music connected with the king in torment and soothed him in his distress. Who could ever forget the shepherd boy from Bethlehem who defeated a giant and became king? Next time, we're going to be talking about Solomon and his reign, how Solomon was the one who finally built the temple, securing Jerusalem as the center of Jewish life and faith forever. But until then, I am so glad that you could join me, and peace be with you.